a sec.
So while they're getting set up and getting everything configured, I'll just do a brief introduction. This is Andrew Blaich. He has, got one that raises his hand. 10 years in mobile security, 3 of that has been spent threat hunting, which I think I'll touch on a little bit more, basically tracking down bad guys. Largely state actors, but including in that, and he'll explain a little bit more why, that includes spouseware, so people tracking down their spouses as well, so trying to figure out where those threats are coming from. And then we have Mike Flossman. He also tracks down different malicious groups and also has about 10 years in different security fields, some of it working with Lookout, but some other agencies, entities as well, if that's correct. Great. Funny story is that I was at the Black Hat Security Conference in Las Vegas this year. One of the rare times I actually get to leave my area, my work area, and go somewhere neat and hot. And so I was walking down to a different event, not having read the agenda clearly, or else I would have been going to their presentation. But I happened to see one of the banners talking about the topic, and a word caught my eye. It said spouseware. And I said, I had no idea this was going on. I had no idea anybody was talking about it in the context of some of the other things they're talking about, which we'll hear a little bit more here. And I said, I'd really like to key in on that. So I sat in on the presentation. And even I, who tried to stay up to date on cyber things and computer things, was really blown away by what they're doing on a daily basis, but also what they're finding on a daily basis as well. So I did ask, I started a conversation afterwards, and they were gracious enough to come and share the same information with you. So I will turn it over to Andrew and Michael.
Sweet. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thanks, dude. Yeah, hi. Thanks for inviting us out here, and it's really good to be here. Where should I stand? Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm Michael Flossman. This is Andrew Blaich. We spend a lot of our time doing splunking through mobile data, basically. So looking for interesting actors that have a mobile capability, so that might be spying on different people for certain reasons. And yeah, we've produced while we mainly focus on nation-state like campaigns and operations, there's definitely overlap when it comes to spouseware. A lot of the capabilities, as we'll see in this presentation, are kind of similar. So we'll go through who are the different players that we see in this ecosystem. We see a lot of cybercrime, a lot of nation-state actors, but as I said, also a lot of spouseware. And then kind of we'll transition into what we see on the adversary tooling side of things. So when it comes to people targeting mobile devices, what does their tradecraft look like? Why are they actually targeting mobile devices? What information can they get off them, and what should we be aware of as defenders when it comes to why they're actively deploying tools to compromise our mobile endpoints? And I think it's really important to also have a look at how they're doing this. What are the different attack vectors that we commonly see them using? How do they actually gain a foothold on your device? We've probably heard of some really sophisticated approaches that might have been mentioned in the press. And that's mostly because they're really compelling stories, but when it comes to sophistication and adversary sophistication, more often than not, they simply don't have to be that sophisticated when it comes to getting on our mobile endpoints. And throughout our research, we often come across servers that are inappropriately secured. And what that means is that not only are people compromising our mobile devices and stealing our sensitive personal data, but the way they're storing it is in such a way that is really insecure. And as we'll see, that means anyone can pretty much get access to it. So it really opens up the risk. And then to close things up, we'll take a look at how we can actually protect ourselves. What are the approaches we can take to see if our phones are being compromised, and ways we can, in the event we are compromised, actually remediate, remove the malware that might be there, the spouseware, and basically several best practices that we can follow to make it significantly harder for those trying to get spouseware onto our devices to actually do that. So one of the things that we see quite a lot, or the actors that we see operating in this space, are nation states. There's a lot of value that can be had out of mobile endpoints. These are the devices that are with us all the time. They're usually always on. We sleep with them next to our beds, and we use them to access enterprise information. So they can kind of access a significant amount of really valuable intelligence for nation state actors. Similarly, as you can probably guess, those actors that are financially motivated, they've obviously got value in creating some sort of mobile capability to financially profit. So we see a lot of banking Trojans, which is it's basically a tool that when it's on your mobile device, if you ever log into your bank or use your banking application on your phone to make transactions or check your account balance, it will actually steal your credentials so that the people running these operations can get rich pretty quickly. And we're seeing a surge in activity from different malware families that fall into that category of cybercrime. Hacktivists, while they mostly play in the desktop space, they are kind of spreading out and seeing value in actually having a mobile capability. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of Spouseware as well. And there's a significant amount of overlap between a lot of these different categories. So we see groups fall into the nation state category and also on the side kind of have a Spouseware component as well, which is kind of surprising when we first saw it, but it's really prevalent and there's a lot of it out there. So when we think of the capabilities that our phone can actually do and why it might be of value for an actor seeking to either learn more about us or to exploit the information on our endpoints for financial gain, there's a lot of functionality in these devices. They're going to have our immediate social network, so all our contacts, how often we call these people, for how long, and it's a really easy way for adversaries to kind of build out a profile of us or of whoever owns that device and really understand their lifestyles. So that can include things like tracking where they are, at what time of day, recording calls when they're made, or just capturing audio at a certain point in time. So, if we know that, for example, a senior executive is in a meeting at a certain time, then an attacker could actually just trigger a phone that they control to record audio, and that could result in some sensitive information falling into their hands. So as I said, these things are always with us. They're always connected, and people hardly ever reboot them. So it provides adversaries with a continual insight into our lives, which makes it a really attractive target, and it's why adversaries are always evolving their tooling for mobile platforms. So we've seen a number of different groups that have had like a desktop capability, and we've seen them kind of expand into this space over the last couple of years. So I can keep going. So looking under the hood of some of the different premium tools that we see being sold, on the market, there's a lot of capability that is really quite standard. So we see tools being able to record audio, as I said, like either when you make a call out or when an adversary triggers that functionality to actually take place. They can continually track our location, so no matter where we are, they can find out where we are at a certain point in time, and then kind of have that historical information, so they can see if we have a certain routine or if we take a certain route every day. And then we see a lot of malware actually exfiltrating multimedia information. So this might be whatever content someone sent you via WhatsApp, and it might be sitting on your phone. Or content you've downloaded in an email or text messages. That kind of content is pretty much up for grabs for a lot of tooling that we'll see out there will go after this content. And then we also see a lot of generic things like just standard device information. So understanding what sort of model phone someone is operating on, and kind of tracking that information, what sort of applications they might have installed. Recording the keystrokes, and basically all of this is just to get a really good insight into the owner of a certain device. And then as I mentioned, like contact information, so associated email addresses, phone numbers, names. If an application is actually able to root a device, then it will access any sort of chat material from certain applications like WhatsApp, Signal, Viber. And yeah, there are a number of other capabilities. I guess the biggest one to flag out here in high-end premium surveillanceware tools, which costs upwards of $100,000, is that the main differentiator is that they have optional premium exploits. And essentially what that is it means that companies that are deploying tools like this can usually exploit your phone, or they can install their app on your phone, usually without you knowing, through some vulnerability that might exist in your operating system. So there's a lot of money tied to those sorts of capabilities, which means they're pretty hard to come by. They're usually really expensive, and for the most part, they're reserved for use by law enforcement. But if you have enough money, you can kind of get your hands on these things pretty easily. Going on the flip side, if we look at how much does a Spouseware tool cost? It's less than $100 typically for like a year's license. And as you can see, the capabilities in such a cheap tool as this one, which is less than $100, it's the same as that premium slide that we just saw. So capabilities are identical. You might notice that one thing changed, and that was the presence of the premium exploit. So being able to get on your device without you really interacting, or without you installing an application knowingly. So the underlying functionality, it's really the same, if that makes sense. And then there are a few other differentiators when you take a look at the high-end capabilities as well. So this is an example of a tool sold by Gamma Group. It's called FinFisher. It's usually used by law enforcement, but we've seen it like deployed against activists and dissidents in the past. So in this case, just to be aware of like some of the capabilities that it can do, basically those people deploying this tool can interact with this specific instance of FinFisher and trigger it to carry out certain types of functionality if they call it from a certain number. So you can see that there are two numbers listed there, and they're essentially control phones, which is something you tend to see more in premium products. And I guess it's just a lot more flexible in terms of deployment. And as an adversary running an operation and deploying one of these premium tools, this is a really good example of what you would see. So you'd be able to kind of manage your operation. You can see that they've got a laptop, a configuration for this laptop, and a mobile phone that they're also targeting. And they can kind of enable different types of functionality to actually be active. So you can see they're actually getting calls. They've got contacts in calendar turned off. You can see just how modular it really is. And yeah, I mean, this is the interface for actually seeing call recordings and environment audio that's being captured by this tool. And geolocation tracking, right down to the street, so you can see exactly where someone is at any point in time, and it's historical, which is really useful for adversaries. And this is the admin console for a tool produced by Hacking Team, which is like a really notorious Italian surveillanceware company that mostly deals with law enforcement, but as I said, in most cases, if you have enough cash, they'll probably sell it to you as well. Jumping to the commodity tooling and taking a look at like what a Spouseware admin panel looks like. This is a panel for a tool that costs approximately $50. And while it's a bit more ghetto, it's got exactly the same pieces of functionality that we saw in that high-end tool admin panel. So you can see things like you can easily record the surrounding audio. You can enable certain types of functionality on a device. You can use the front or the back camera to take a photo whenever you like. You can enable or disable your location tracking, reboot the device, access text messages, browser history, phone calls. It's pretty much complete access to everything. Yeah, question?
What level of, I guess, technological savvy or sophistication would a user need to be able to, I guess, navigate these various tools?
Yeah. So the question was, how sophisticated do you need to be to actually operate these tools? Not at all, really. It's definitely lowered the bar for, you don't need any programming experience. You receive really comprehensive details on how to actually install these applications onto target devices. It's really as easy as you just need to know how to log into a service. Yep. They just give you a username and password, you log in, you have access to this. There's
this would be like logging into just a general website that you could access from any phone or computer anywhere in the world. And even the sophistication, which we'll get into later, about how you would get this on a person's phone, a target's phone. It's not that complicated, actually. It's pretty straight. It's just simply installing an application on the device, and either through physical access or through phishing them into installing the application itself. So it's kind of and that's kind of like what we're trying to show is there's a lot of similarities between the high-end stuff that you'll see a lot of nation states use and a lot of the low-end stuff as well as you'll see in commodity Spouseware and related tooling like that as well. A lot of common features that use the data it can access, and even just the consoles and panels that are there, it all kind of operates very similarly.
No worries. Yes, this is another panel from the same product. You can see, once again, location tracking. It's just using Google Maps, overlaying a user's location onto Google Maps. And once again, there's no technical skill required by these people to actually use this tool and issue instructions to a compromised phone. It's really easy for them to run this kind of operation, and it's really cheap as well. So I mean, this specific tool, I think, ranges between 50 and 100 euros. You could probably find it for free, though. I think they offer trials as well. So I don't know if you want to take this one.
Yeah, so FlexiSpy, they've kind of they're kind of a bigger name in this space for a variety of reasons, which we'll get to later. They've had some data breaches as well, but they advertise themselves as primarily as a way of doing parental control software, as a way of protecting your kids is kind of how they will advertise the software as, to kind of try to skirt some legal issues around how it actually might be used in practice. But what you see basically is and you can visit these pages. You can Google for names like mobile phone spying, or if you can just Google specific company names, this stuff will come up right away through Google or any of the search engines. But then they all have similar types of consoles. In this access for FlexiSpy, you'll see this is just viewing text messages that have been pulled off the phone and that are now viewable in the console, which is the web. So this is FlexiSpy now has the data, and the user who's controlling this infection can now see, okay, what messages have you collected in the last couple of days? Where have they been going to? Who are you contacting specifically? And then it'll put it in a nice format so you can see kind of as the user would see it as well, in that format of who was sending, who was receiving, as the user would see it, as well as all the other types of data there. Michael mentioned all the multimedia, right? So a lot of this stuff as well is it tries to grab as much data as it can off the phone, and that includes any sort of pictures that might be on there, whether you took them yourself, whether you were sending or receiving them within the chat messaging applications, and then that stuff will be taken up as well to the server, and then providing a gallery basically for the operator to view and see this information, and then any of the metadata that might be associated with that, including yes, question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Your previous slide had SMS messaging.
Yes.
As the title. You learned yesterday that if you're trading iMessages between somebody, that those are encrypted. Would you be able to pull those as well, or just SMS?
Yeah, great question. So the question is with things like SMS messages can be pulled off a device, but are things like iMessages, which are end-to-end encrypted, can they be intercepted or exfiltrated to a system like this? Yes and no. It depends on how you're attacking it. So, and we'll get into a little bit of the nuance later, but if something like iMessages, if you're allowing them to be backed up to iCloud, those are not encrypted in iCloud. So, and one of the attacks for this stuff against the iPhone is to actually access the user's iCloud account and then take that back up and display it in the console. So that's one avenue where you would do that. So things that do end-to-end encryption, yes, it's protected in transit, but on the phone, and if you're in the right position, either on the device or, as we said, within the backup, you can actually read those messages and things like that as well. And we'll get into more details and take more interesting questions around that in a little bit there for sure. But yeah, so SMS is inherently, just as you're aware, are insecure messaging platforms. So if you are sending if anyone's sending any sensitive information over SMS, I wouldn't, because just the medium in which it's sent is not secured, right? Like any end-to-end is not encrypted at all. So anyone that's listening can see that, like telecoms, anyone else on the line. But yes, they're also not encrypted on the phone either. That includes MMS if you're sending pictures and videos as well. All that stuff is not encrypted end-to-end as well. So that's pretty easy stuff to grab and take off the phone and device. Yeah, so for terms of like how this stuff actually gets onto the device and stuff like that, we kind of see similar approaches between both the high-end government-grade stuff and the spouseware things. A lot of this is something, these are examples from things that we've seen kind of on the nation state and middle ground in terms of commodity remote access monitoring and Trojans that are out there. So there'll be cases like on the far left or your right, or my right, your left, the kind of spear phishing attacks where you basically, you know about who you're targeting and you kind of have some information and you coax them into clicking a link to install an application on their phone, which will then infect the device and allow the spouseware to be installed or the the nation state malware to be installed. In that case, in the case of ViperRat, there was it was a group targeting a very specific group of people in the world, and so they would create fake personas, get them to chat up a little bit on like on a platform like WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, and then they would get them to click a link to install an application to chat on a different platform, and at that point that person gets infected with the malware, essentially. And it's kind of similar techniques that happen, less sophistication here and there, but they kind of all roll down to this area of just phishing the user, getting them to click a link and install the malware and things like that. Other sorts of attacks we see are physical access to the phone. So if someone puts their phone down for a little bit, leaves to go to the bathroom or go down to the, they're in a hotel or their house and they leave and they come back, someone can go in and try to grab that phone and put something malicious onto that device as well. And there's a number of different ways they can do that. Which is why one of the recommendations we say is you should put a passcode on your phone so that someone can't get into it as easily. There obviously are mechanisms depending on weak passcodes or if someone else knows that passcode, they can get into the phone. So you want to make that secure, but one of the attacks we do see is physical access where someone will come in and depending on their sophistication level, will try to install some malware on the phone, or they actually just might try to make a backup of the phone and pull whatever data is off of that without actually leaving an implant on there as well, for sure. Now, for kind of specifically to like a lot of the spouseware stuff that we see in installation vectors, there's a lot of different ways in which this stuff can get on, and we can go through each of these specific cases based on questioning and stuff like that. But one of the obvious ways is to be phished, is to click a link, install an application on your phone, and then that will start taking data off of it. We talked about physical access. An app is installed on the device when the device has been out of your hands for a little bit of time, and it'll go on there. And then there's this concept of rooted versus unrooted, which basically means whether the device has been compromised and someone can do something that normally you can't do on the device itself. And if you if you read some of these manuals, especially on like FlexiSpy as an example, they provide different options. Like if you can root this device, you can install this piece of this, you can install this special component of our software, which will give you more data access than you normally would be able to get access to. So it's one of the reasons why we recommend definitely is not to have a device that's rooted, even if you prefer that as an advanced user, because that leaves you open to interesting types of compromise. Now in iOS, it's a little bit of a different story. A lot of the iOS malware, especially in case of with spouseware, requires that the phone already be jailbroken, which means typically how this stuff works in the commodity space is that a public exploit's already been released and someone goes and downloads it and runs it on the phone to compromise the phone, and then they install a special package on the device, which then installs the special malware implant that does all the magic stuff of taking the data off the phone and things like that. A lot of these, though, use known solutions. Like one such jailbreaking solution right now is called Electra. These typically operate on older versions of iOS, so if you're always on the latest and greatest, you're most likely patched against these sorts of situations. But if you have a phone that's not on the latest version of the OS, you leave a little bit of risk there for the device to be compromised by kind of public jailbreaks like this. Now, I mentioned the iCloud access. That's one of the mechanisms, whereas if you can't install an app or you can't get a jailbroken phone, but the target is backing up to iCloud, which you can use for a variety of reasons, but you can select which data gets backed up within the phone. But that iCloud backup is one avenue that someone might go after to take that backup and then get all the data out of that as well. So some of these solutions have that as an option that will then, it'll connect to Apple servers, download it, and then show the data in the console itself as well. And the final version actually is this concept of Trojanized apps where either through physical access, through phishing, they'll get you to install, like let's say a copy of WhatsApp on the phone, right? If that's your preferred messaging thing. You might be using WhatsApp on your phone and think it's the real version, but someone might have Trojanized that. And there's actually some indicators to look for to see if that has been the case, if someone has tried to replace the copy on your phone with a version that's not the real version, essentially like that.
Are any of those available directly through the Apple Store? They're all just jailbreak apps?
Right, good question. The question was, are any like the Trojanized apps available to the App Store? They're typically not in the official stores. They're actually, you get them through third-party sites, or someone takes one and develops it and tries to either install it themselves with physical access or through phishing them through a link to it through a website as well. A lot of the nation-state stuff we see is typically how they'll do it is they'll develop it themselves, they'll host it on a site that may look like a store, and then get them to do that. So one of the recommendations we'll talk about is to really only get your apps from the trusted first-party stores. It doesn't completely eliminate the risk, but it helps minimize against possible fakes and things like that as well that exist out there. Right, and this is just an example to kind of show, like, you know, even when you're installing this, this is an example of installing it on Android, Flexi Spy, is that the manual actually has you go through a set of steps to turn off some of the security features so that it won't send the malware up to Google and it won't be alerted if something's going on. So indicators to look for is if the automatic scanning for security threats on the phone by Google has been disabled, for example, is one such way of maybe something weird has gone on here. Turn that back on, see if anything gets detected and things like that as well, for sure. Yeah, and so that's kind of like what we've seen with on the, you know, a lot of the capabilities and stuff, and we'll go into a little bit more depth later, but the companies as well that operate these tooling and stuff have not been, they don't necessarily protect the data that's been collected as well, opening up it to a larger audience that could potentially get this exfiltrated data that should not necessarily have it either as well. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. So I think just being able to see how prevalent these tools are allows us to gain a really good understanding of just how widely used they are, unfortunately. And it's quite surprising. It was surprising for me, definitely looking at some of the families that we come across to see just like the significant uptake they've had in usage and just how many targets there are around the world, how many victims. So as Andrew said, a lot of infrastructure, more often than not, isn't secured properly, and people that do a bit of digging can often gain access to all this data that's been taken. So not only is it a party that's targeting a certain individual, but it could be any other third party that we have no idea who they are, that also has access to all this data that's been taken. And that can be, you know, basically all the capabilities that we've covered. It could be anything relating to that. So images, recordings, call logs, pretty much the whole gamut. Yeah, so in the past 2 months, 9 companies have been publicly reported as being breached. But the actual number is a lot higher than that. When we do any kind of research into a Spouseware family, it's quite common for there to be holes here and there that any other party could pretty much use to basically pull all that stolen data into their own, onto their own servers. Yeah, so some of these companies are also repeat offenders. MSpy, they really obviously don't really care too much about protecting the information that's been taken from a lot of compromised devices. So as a result, we're kind of in this situation where a lot of their servers are continuously being flagged as having inadequate security, which you know, leads to this problem of anyone being able to gain access to this content. So what does that look like when it comes to nation-state actors? You know, they're also pretty bad when it comes to securing some of their servers when they're actually deploying surveillanceware. So in this case, you know, we mentioned ViperAt, a family used in the past that was using spear phishing to actually compromise mobile devices. And what we found in their case is that they also inadequately secured some of their infrastructure, which allowed us to retrieve a lot of that content, figure out who they were targeting, where their different operations were deployed, and ultimately highlight that it's a tool that's being used almost exclusively against the Israeli Defense Force. So a lot of that stolen content on those servers that we're able to freely access, and so was anyone else, painted a really interesting story. So we could see things like internal military briefings, different military folk, internal communications, different ID cards. So this is like at the nation state level, and the same thing applies, as we'll see, to Spouseware. Yeah, so like tracking through this, we can kind of see the different squads and military teams being deployed, where they're actually training, who they're meeting, and also on the bottom right, like the software development classes that they're taking too. And then when we actually combine that with the geolocation information, we can see where these different teams are being deployed. We can see, as we'd expect, Israeli Defense Force people deployed along the border to the north, as well as to the east with Jordan and Oman. That is Jordan. And then on the right, we've also got someone taking a trip to Belgium and traveling through Antwerp. So this is like real-time geolocation information for all of these targets, and it provides the adversary that's running this campaign against the IDF with a really good insight into where these people are deployed, how they're operating, what their daily lives look like, and they can use that to further their intelligence mission, basically. On the Spouseware side of things, it's a similar sort of picture. So this is one particular family that we saw deployed in Brazil. The servers were not properly secured. And basically what we can see here is pinpoints of all the different devices that are communicating back to this infrastructure, and you can see just how dense and the high amount of devices that are just spread across this country.
And what's interesting with this one is this is most likely being used just for employee tracking. That's another advertised feature for some of these things, is that some countries and some companies in these countries will do employee tracking, so they'll force it to be on the employees' phones. But you'll see that the same level of data that you're getting from the nation state stuff is the same level that you're getting in this other sorts of realms as well, because of this stuff. So this provides like high resolution tracking of the whole country, basically.
Yeah. And we're also seeing a lot of regional specific tools, so capabilities that are sold in certain regions of the world. While the one we just saw on the last slide was like specific to Brazil and certain parts of South America, in this case, this tool is like really only used in Czech Republic, Slovakia, and I think Slovenia. Yeah, so same sort of thing, high fidelity tracking of different people, and what we haven't shown here is all the communication and like audio recordings and images that also come off all these devices. But hopefully it just gives you an insight into just how prevalent these tools are. Because I think we've all heard of Spouseware, but it's another thing to actually be able to see just how much information is being taken off these devices and how prevalent they are, how prevalent the installation is. And this is another tool that is more financially focused, but you can see it's got a considerable spread across the United States. And I mean, this was taken 2 weeks ago, and it's just gathering a lot of data from target environments. So who's actually creating these things? During a recent investigation, we're actually able to identify 2 individuals that were responsible for creating a tool that was ultimately sold to the Pakistani military and used in their deployments. But on the side, they're also using a certain version of this as a Spouseware product. So it really goes to show that like the nation-state tooling is really not that dissimilar to what we're seeing on the Spouseware side of things. The capabilities are identical, and in fact, it turns out that the people creating them are also the same. So these 2 guys were responsible for that specific tool. So Faisal Hanif on the left, he's responsible for a lot of the infrastructure and spinning up the servers that support these operations. And on the right is Sajid Iqbal, who's a mobile developer as well as a desktop developer. Their background overlaps a bit. They worked at the same places. Interestingly enough, they're actually reported on several years ago as actually having created been involved in targeted attacks against certain individuals. And I mean, they were mentioned in that report 2 years ago. They really didn't care. So it was surprising to see them continuing to just operate. And since then, we've actually linked them to the deployment of a number of different tools. So on the commercial side of things, or commodity tooling side of things, they've been using tools like AndroWrap, which is another tool you can just buy off the shelf. It's pretty cheap. They also created their own one called Smesh App, and then in addition to this, they've kind of had a number of different Spouseware products on the side, such as Ringster, Tracozy, Stealth Genie, and the OneSpy, that they all do the same thing. They're all just focused on gathering your personal data off these devices. But it was interesting to see that the same people were managing multiple companies that all offered a Spouseware product. And I'm guessing it's just a numbers game. The more fake Spouseware, or the more companies you have pushing the same sort of Spouseware product with a different, badging over the cover, maybe the more profitable you will be. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about what this is now. How to actually protect yourself and remediate against if you find it there, or to prevent it from getting on there as best you can. So we talked a number of different ways. One of the main things is, like, if you're encountering someone with a phone, make sure their phone is as up to date as it possibly can be. Obviously on Android this is a little bit of an issue, but on iOS you can ensure the latest version of the operating system is on there. Because really you want to patch against any sort of vulnerabilities that are out there in case someone is taking advantage of that, like we talked about with the older versions that could be jailbroken using public exploits. Definitely educating the user to think twice for any sort of phishing attacks against links. If a message comes from someone they don't know, probably don't click it, but if they come from someone they know and they're trying to get you to install an application, think twice about that. You should really only get your apps from the main store itself. Is kind of really to follow from that case and those things. Sometimes if you're unsure, like if you're in a situation where you're trying to get an application and you're unsure if it's the real app, look at the application in the store, look at the reviews, try to figure out if it's the real one or not. You can look at the number of install counts. If it's in the millions, it's probably the real app that you're looking for, most likely. If it has a couple hundred, it's a possibility that it might be a fake version, so you want to take a look at that as well. If you have a phone without a PIN code, set one. Make sure you can lock people out from getting it. Typically, the more complex or the longer the passcode is, the better it is. It takes longer for someone to get into it.
Don't write it down.
Don't write it down. I mean, you can also don't use 6 zeros as your passcode. That's an easily guessable one.
That's true.
Based on common news going around today and yesterday. And with the PIN code and pattern, like if you do have one set, if you use a pattern lock like Android has, or you want to use a simple PIN code as numeric, try to make sure it's secret to yourself. Don't share that out. Don't let someone else have it, because once they do that, they can access your phone and they can do pivot any other direction we kind of talked about earlier to get this stuff onto your device. So really make sure that you keep that protected and safe, or you change it every now and again as well in case you think someone may have it. That's there. I think something clicked. And so then finally we kind of broke it up into 4 different categories you can kind of think about to protect yourself. Not just on your mobile phone, but just kind of in your digital presence as well. So number one, for like things about logging into sites and authenticating into them as well. If you have a password manager, it's really great to use that, because that will allow you to store your passwords in a situation, and also you can use more complex passwords and also cycle through them instead of having to use the same. So try to avoid using the same password on the same site or across many sites, but using the same password, because then if someone gets this one password, they can use that against any of your other sites to try to access any of your other social media things. Oh, questions? Yes.
What is reparable? Yeah, no, not reparable. Highly recommended password manager that you all would suggest?
Oh. Do you have one you like?
So the question was, is there a password manager that we would recommend? I use KeePassX on my desktop.
There's
and
also
that's KEE Pass.
There's also ones called like LastPassword or 1Password. They're pretty good as well. And they have versions that'll work on your desktop, your laptop, your phones as well, so you can sync those codes and keep them all safe across things as well. But that also lets you, as I said, lets you use more complex codes and change them easily when something happens, or you can then log in as well on the different sites. Don't share your passwords. It's not common knowledge, but people do that, especially if they're sharing like account logins and stuff. Like people are bound to share Netflix logins and other sorts of media logins things. They might use the same password. You want to try to avoid that as well, because sometimes that can enable access to other sorts of accounts and things. On top of that, there's something known as two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. This is, if you're not familiar with it, is like you log in with your main password and then it asks you to enter another, like usually like a PIN number or something like that. And typically how you get that code is kind of up to how the provider allows you to get it. Sometimes it might text message you the code. Other times you might have an app on your phone that generates the code. If you have a service that allows this, please turn it on, because it will provide a second level authentication. And that this means that if someone else is trying to get to your account, they also have to be able to generate this PIN code to get into your account as well. And two-factor has come in, it used to be primarily SMS. It's evolved into these authenticating apps like Google Authenticator or Duo Security on your phone. But additionally now there's new solutions like hardware solutions from things like YubiKey and Google Titan, where you can plug in a special piece of hardware into your phone or your computer, and then that'll act as your two-factor auth token for sites that support these hardware access features. So things like Gmail support these things. I think there's a few other sites as well that are starting to support their services that are supporting these more often than not as well. And you can have this in addition to using an authenticator app, but it does provide another level of something someone has to have to get in if they manage to have your main password or guess it or things like that as well. And then finally for this set, there's a Google definitely has it, and other services have this as well. If you ever kind of try to see if anyone has logged into your account from like an unknown location, you can kind of get alerted and see where that's happened in the past several hours, days, months. And if you see any kind of unrecognized logins coming in from a space maybe you're not in, you can force sign off all the other locations for that person's account and then log back in and then see if anything else is going on to kind of audit if any weird activity is happening as well on those accounts. So it's really good to have practice some good hygiene around this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. App stores and malicious profiles. This is kind of how this stuff gets onto your phone. You want to start off? That's okay. So the primary advice that we mentioned a bit before was get your apps on the first-party stores. There are a number of third-party stores out there, and obviously this is regional. Like some countries don't have this as the first-party stores, but the US has these as the first-party stores. So it's important to get your apps from these because you don't know what you're going to get from somewhere else. And as we mentioned, look at the reviews. If you're unsure if that's the link to the application, then go to the main website for that company and then click there. They'll probably have a referral link that'll go back in either one of these forms that'll go back to the site that'll tell you which one to actually get and to download onto your device. And then as we mentioned, we didn't mention actually, Androids have this ability for allowing unknown sources. So if you try to download an app from a web browser or something outside of the main store, allowing unknown sources will allow that app to be installed. If you turn that off, then it provides this, there'll be a block on the screen that won't let that be installed. And so having that disabled is another layer of preventing an app from accidentally being installed onto your phone. On the iOS side, vectors that things could happen, and we kind of mentioned all these because while some of these may not be used now, they are techniques and tools that we do see used in other sorts of things. So they at some point in time could make their way down to the commodity spouseware stalker market as well. So it's something to keep aware of as a way of if people are trying to redirect your network traffic and your data or spy on your phone with malicious stuff. On iOS, if you install an app outside of the App Store, it has to have something what's called a provisioning profile associated with it so that it's not technically signed by Apple, it's signed by someone else, but it's not being distributed through the Apple App Store. But these are actually listable in a settings menu on the iPhone device, which you can see. And if you see one of these, you should take action and say, oh, is that an app that you knew you installed, that you meant to install? Or if it's not, then you should remove that profile, which will remove the application itself, which could be a Trojan or some sort of spouseware stalkerware that's on the device as well. Also, kind of on the Android side, some Spouseware apps will request something called device admin privileges. Basically, it gives them full control over the device to basically lock it when they want, unlock it, wipe it, do a bunch of things that you would do at a high level, and even tracks the device location-wise, find out where it is at all points in time. Users can audit their phones and see if they have them, if they have any device admins enabled. Like, for example, this one, though, is one of Google's Android device managers, one that Google provides, and you can see that on the phone. But something like Tasker or something you may not want on your phone to have device admin privileges. And so typically, Stalkerware will use these to remain on the device, because if you try to remove the app, device admin will prevent it from being removed, and you have to go through a couple extra steps to remove it. But also, it does give the person more access to data and control over the phone. So you want to kind of audit what these things are on the device. And then finally, it's kind of an older point, but it still might apply in certain situations. If you notice that your battery is draining more often than not, faster than normal, kind of monitor the power levels. Some of these have graphs where you can see the power levels for certain apps. If an app seems to be using more power, or you just don't recognize the app that's using all that data, all that power, investigate it, maybe take it off or see what's going on with it, because it might be something trying to pretend to be something that it's not, basically, in those situations. Around things like secured networks, this is one of the things we always say is, like, there's like a lot of free Wi-Fi around here these days. You can connect. It's really important to try to stay off free unsecured Wi-Fi as best as possible, because if you're on for free and there's no password on it, anyone else can join. And if someone's on that, they can spy on any of the network traffic that's going on that network. And so if you're using an app or something that's not securing its communication channels, any of that data going onto that network could be leaked for an attacker to listen to and see what's going on. If you do need to use one of these networks, which you can, it's recommended to possibly try to find a VPN service to use that will encrypt your connection and protect you on that local network until you can connect to where you need to connect to, basically. So it's one of the important things around that as well. Just thinking kind of the adversarial model of, like, who might be on listening and what they might do with the data they might see on there as well. And then finally, there's a notion of using security software. Obviously, we're from a security vendor, so one of the things we put this on our phones, because it will scan for and help you at least detect if there's something that's known that's bad on there. So there's a lot of known Spouseware, Stalkerware out there that can be flagged and detected on that you can take action on, at least know that it's there and remove it, because these things do try to hide themselves from the general user to see that. So Lookout's one example. There's a lot of other examples in the stores if you look around for security solutions like this. Luckily enough, the Lookout Foundation was happy to provide us with a set of free premium codes for the service as well. So we have them on the table out there if anyone wants to take some for who they work with or provide elsewhere as well. So happy to provide that, and hopefully that can help. Yeah, that's about it. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any more questions you might have around this area topic. I know it's a lot of information. Some of it might seem scary, but we'll try to make it approachable and all that stuff. Yeah, oh, sure, thanks.
Actually, just in case there are questions that come up, I do have the microphone, so you don't have to repeat the questions. I can still pick it up as well. But I do have one. Sure. I did see a point on there about setting a PIN on your phone, which is good advice, but not always an option for the audience that these people here may support. So where a PIN might not be sufficient because they're not allowed to have one or forced to give it up. So what do you do if that's not an option as far as securing your device? What other options do you have?
Good question.
That's a tricky one.
Tough question.
I'd say perhaps good practice could be to regularly check what applications are installed on a device and just get familiar with what are common applications that you're seeing in that list of installed apps, and then I think that's a bit trickier. I mean. Like opening the door up for the attacker. I guess
if you're in a situation where you can't have that have that type of security mechanism like enabled, think about that as a model, right? That, hey, I can't put this on there. That means if I leave my phone unattended at any point in time, someone could come and grab this and get what's off of that very easily. So in those cases, you just think about what they're putting on their phone. If they're taking sensitive pictures or the type of data that's on that device, and really think about that and think in the back of what you're really going to put on the device for those situations, and also maybe not let the phone out of your sight if you possibly can, if that's the situation you're in.
Installing security solutions as well that might actually flag the installation of any of those tools that might be used as well. Could be something else that might be beneficial.
My question is sort of a follow-up to that. I'm not sure about the other people in this room, but most of the attackers that I deal with are very low budget, low skill, probably won't have programming experience or coding experience. In a situation which may be that the person's not able to secure their device, or their boyfriend they share a computer, or he has to know her PIN. What do you think is the most common of these that they might face for a totally tech-free couple? Say she doesn't have a jailbroken phone and he wouldn't know how to boot it anyway. Are there any of these that he would be able to install from more user-friendly, legitimate means?
Yeah, definitely on the Android side, it's like there are a lot of tools that are really accessible. That it would just be a matter of some actually do sneak into the Play Store, so even like they wouldn't even have to enable third-party like installs. They could just download from the official store, follow a really easy kind of tutorial on how to manage it. But was your question how to defend against that, or?
Well, it was more yes. Well, let's say the follow-up question. We just say besides monitoring the battery usage and the security settings, what would be the easiest way to realize that something like that was going on?
Other than auditing the applications and stuff to see if something has been on there. The thing we mentioned about account access, so if accessing the account to access the backups that are made by those, if you can disable the backups on the phone to prevent them from being created, that's one option. If they are being created and you can't, and you're in some, I'm trying to think of the scenario where like, yeah, you can't actually, someone's forcing you to enable this on there for whatever reason, you might have to, make sure two-factor auth is enabled. A lot of companies are now making that mandatory for the system, so that means they have to have access to a device that has to receive that two-factor auth code, so that might come down to the phone itself. So someone will have to still have that in their hand to access the code to do that. You can also think of it like if that's the threat model you're in, is then to try not to use any applications then. Use a browser incognito mode. Or private mode, depending on the, so Safari has private mode, Chrome has incognito mode on desktop, but also on mobile, where if you're browsing in that tab, you can do everything you want, log in, but when you close the tab out, it wipes away the data from the phone itself, and there's no application which persists that on the device as well. So that would be another avenue, so you can still use some of these services, but maintain a minimal footprint on the device in those situations, and make sure you close the tabs out when you're done, but that'll kind of clear it all out of the cache and stuff in those cases. Kind of thinking the most restrictive model as well there, because once you put an app on, then you have to share codes and stuff, someone can access it as well.
Right. Probably to add to that, I'd say if they're on the go and they don't want anyone to know where they're going, I'd just set airplane mode so that there's no GPS information, and they don't have a connection, but I think that's probably the price to pay.
Sure.
Yep. And if you want to be ultra paranoid, then buy a small little forensics bag. They sell them on Amazon. Put your phone in, Velcro it up, and it'll block any signal, even if it is in airplane mode, in case something might accidentally turn it on or whatnot, so you can keep those completely locked out as well and shielded from anything.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
And to kind of translate, that was the Faraday bag that Zoe, same name, just different way to phrase it, but that's what Zoe was talking about yesterday as well. So
different uses,
Right, good advice.
I actually have two questions. One of them was you had mentioned, and this is where my expertise lacks significantly. I know you can get VPN on your computer, but how would somebody get it on their phone?
Yeah, there's a number of different apps you can download from the stores that provide basically VPNs. If you work for a business, obviously you can download those apps and connect to your corporation's networks, but also they do provide free VPN services. There's free VPN services you can download, but also there are paid ones as well where you can pay a monthly or an annual fee or something upfront, and then it's a little bit cheaper for the whole. There's a number of different, if you look around online for like top mobile VPN services, there's a number of ones around there that exist, and they'll let you connect to different servers around the world. It's basically through an application that you install on. Yeah, it's absolutely possible, yeah.
Okay. And my other question was, you had mentioned something like somebody can download a hidden app or an app that looks real but is not real. Is there a way to, on your iCloud or something similar for an Android, view all the apps that you had downloaded onto an account pretty much in perpetuity? Because you know, you go to the App Store and sometimes you see like the little cloud and it's got the arrow and it's like, yeah, I've downloaded this before.
Yeah, there is a way. I don't know if you can do it outside of the phone or not, but on the phone you can see all the apps that have ever been downloaded from the store itself. I believe if you go to the Purchase tab on the iPhone, you can see and just scroll through a long list. I think they might be sorted by when you installed it or downloaded it for the first time, purchased it for the first time. There is a way to see all those apps there. Same is true for Android, I believe. A way of seeing all the apps that have ever been associated with an account that have been downloaded through the first-party stores,
Okay, cool.
Yep. Oh, yes?
Really basic question. Can you guys sort of explain? Oh, I got a good outside voice. Thank you.
No worries.
Could you explain, I guess in layman's terms, just what a VPN does, how it functions?
Oh, sure.
Oh, it's kicking it to me.
Yeah.
So
I'm talking too much.
let's see if I don't get this wrong. So basically what that means is that all traffic from your device will go through a different service. So instead of you making a request, say you want to browse to Gmail or something like that, or just do a Google search instead of directly querying like the Google search service, you'll go through this VPN, you'll do a hop through a different service first.
Is that more secure?
Yeah. So, well, I'd say, well, yes.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. It probably depends on what you're connecting, what you would be connecting to. But and depending on the VPN service itself. But for the most part, if you were to choose like a good reputable VPN service, all your traffic would be like properly encrypted, straight from your device to this service, and then to whatever like endpoint you're trying to access.
So it's basically a way of encrypting, protecting the traffic from where you are up until the point where it might exit wherever. So VPNs it's just sending your data to another location in the world. Could be, downtown, it could be across the country, it could be across the world. But it encrypts the traffic to that endpoint basically, so that if anyone is in between that, they can't see what's happening. Which helps prevent against like those local network attacks where someone's listening in and the traffic itself isn't normally encrypted, but this adds an extra level of protection onto that sort of scenario where someone might try to see what you're doing and they can't necessarily with the VPN. The yes and no thing we mentioned is because depending on who the VPN provider is, sometimes they might try to spy on it at the endpoint, but if the data is encrypted inside that tunnel, it's actually protected. So if you visit like properties like Google and Facebook, they encrypt all their traffic nowadays. So there's less of a chance of something being unencrypted and being leaked out from those mechanisms. But there's a lot of other services that may not be fully encrypted. So it just adds another layer of protection onto that mechanism. Yeah.
So we see like people in China using VPNs a lot because the government doesn't want them to access certain content, but if they use a VPN, they can often, like the government doesn't have insight into what they're searching for and isn't blocking access to that restricted material.
Exactly. Okay, welcome.
How do I know if someone is recording my conversations on the cell phone, and how do I prevent that? Sometimes I'm afraid because in the middle of my conversation, my phone just goes off, or sometimes people call and they don't answer, and then I don't answer so that they can leave a message, but they don't leave a message, but they keep calling. So I want to know if you can give me an idea of what that might be.
Right.
Yeah, I think this goes back to kind of the security controls that we spoke about to kind of make it harder for people that are trying to like put software on your phone to listen to your calls. So definitely things like only installing apps from legitimate sources, making sure you have some sort of antivirus solution. I don't know if you wanted to bring that list up again or.
Yeah, I mean, really, the most likely scenario where someone might try to do it on like your iPhone, for example, would, if they were recording, you would see like a red bar on the top of the phone if you have the latest versions that will say something's recording on the phone. For attacks that actually go and, yeah, that's probably the most likely. The more advanced stuff that we see in the nation state stuff, they can do it silently, but that requires breaking into the phone and doing a number of different things. So if you're following best practices, it's typically not a problem. A lot of the stuff that you brought up is just basically just really annoying marketers. They just keep calling and calling and calling. But you might get suspicious, especially if it's trying to like come from an area code related to your phone and you're not there, or they're very persistent on those things. Typically, someone just calling your phone won't break in or try to record. That doesn't, and this is strictly speaking from recording from your phone itself, right? That doesn't mean someone on the other line, if they call you, isn't recording the conversation itself. There's not much you can really do about that other than being in, I guess, a state that has two-party consent or something like that. But it's just from the actual phone itself that prevent recording is just to kind of look for those banner bars that might be there, and just be getting apps from the trusted sources, because the app stores do a pretty good job of making sure that this stuff doesn't go on normally. Welcome. Yes.
So I guess following up on that, I know a lot of this is prevention, but I'm thinking like the kids are using mom's phone.
Mm-hmm.
They get a text message from dad and they click on the link to download something, and now they've put that spyware on the phone. So how can, and maybe he's not recording his calls with her, he's recording her calls with everybody else.
Sure.
How would she be able, is there a place to take your phone to see any apps that have been downloaded maybe remotely through malware or inadvertently by the kids that you wouldn't want on that device?
Right, so that's where some of the security solutions will come into play, where they'll flag applications that might be on the phone that are doing these capabilities maliciously. Some of the stuff we talked about, where if like on an iPhone and there's a profile on there, you can see if that's there and you can take it off yourself, kind of after the fact. For Android, really, there's a list. You can look at the list of apps on the phone, and if you see anything that you don't recognize or not being there, you can try to remove it, and then take that off as well. There are most of the. I don't know if there's any like. I'm trying to think.
I mean, the part that's tricky with looking at that list of apps is that, first off, there'll probably be a large number, especially if you just bought it from T-Mobile and there's a whole bunch of bloatware and you're like, what is this stuff? But then also, secondly, that some of these tools just try to name themselves legitimately, so they might be like Google Play Store, and you'd be like, well, it's Google Play Store. I've got an Android phone, it's normal. So I think that's something that's worth keeping in mind as well. So I think like either looking at that list of installed apps when you have a good idea that your phone is in an uncompromised state, and then kind of working off that and just being like, well, something's been added here, and trying to minimize the amount of apps you have installed. So going back to like what Andrew said before about like trying to keep a low app profile on your device, because that'll make the whole triage process of trying to figure out, is something that shouldn't be here actually on my device? Yeah, because it's that whole list of apps that are on a stock phone that make it challenging. So just blowing them away.
Kind of to play off on that a little bit more, like especially at least with Lookout, if you install it on the phone and you're a customer and you can email the support line saying, I think something's up, can you tell me what's going on? Like the support can usually take a look and see, if something shouldn't be there on the phone, or if there was a detection, and help you take some action against that as well. So there's a number of security solutions out there that can at least help you with that app process and walk you through that step, at least in those cases. Yeah. Yes.
It's actually a silly question. When you're in the App Store, you typically have to use your thumbprint nowadays to allow it to download.
Sure.
Will these third-party apps and other things like that bypass that entirely? Like if someone's trying to remotely download an app onto your phone, or
good question.
install a third-party app?
Right, good question. So those cases will not. No, you won't have to put your Touch ID on. So typically, because the Touch ID is used for like a purchase, like Touch ID or Face ID is used for purchasing, to authorize the purchase request, not necessarily just to initiate the install of the application. Now, there's two ways also to look at this though. So for on iPhone, on iOS, if you install an app, like you're talking about through a third-party source, there is this notion of a profile that has to come with it. If you try to launch the app before you've accepted the profile, you'll get a big dialogue saying, you need to go accept this profile, which means you have to go back through the settings, and most people actually give up at that point. But if you go through the general settings and stuff, you can navigate a couple menus and then accept the profile and allow it to go through. I think you might need to enter a PIN code for that, but I have to go check. I have to go check on that one for you. But you can also, but there's a process to, a couple extra steps through that process in order to validate that piece there. On Android, it's once you install it, it's installed. There's no second step on that, just because of how the apps are distributed on the Android side of the house there. But things like having unknown sources disabled, or being on the latest version of Android where they're more specific and enforcing about how often you can do that sort of stuff is there as well. Yeah.
I'd add one more kind of a comment addition to the previous question. Is that we've had some luck, but it's very, very situational dependent or location dependent, as Andrew had said, is that sometimes you have success in bringing your phone into the carrier who can take a look and at least may have more input into what the specific apps do or what belongs or what doesn't. But again, you're relying on the knowledge of the customer service representative that may be working there. Same situation with local law enforcement. Sometimes you have an officer that does happen to know a great deal about the technical threats and sometimes not. So it is kind of important to, like the steps they're talking about here, about understanding what's on your specific phone, what's allowed there, and then what changes have been made. I do have one more question, and I think that, unless there's no other questions after this might be the last one. But oftentimes we see cases, and I'm sure it's the same in this room as well, for those in this room as well, where while the individual is in an abusive situation, they have very few choices about security that they can make. They may not be permitted to have a PIN or to have a private PIN that may have to be shared. May not have the opportunity to install new apps because that raises questions about why. Although with security software, sometimes that's an easy solution or easy thing to explain. I don't like threats in general. But again, if the abuser is doing something malicious or nefarious, then they're going to wonder why that's what countermeasure is being put in place anyways. So in a lot of cases, and in a lot of cases, just changing behavior is suspicious in and of itself. So in a circumstance where the individual has very, very few security options to do what you're saying while they're in the situation, they're acknowledging that they're being tracked while they're in that situation. When they do leave and they have control again and they have options again for their devices and their technology, what should they do then? Right when they leave, what should they do? Is a hardware wipe or is a factory reset sufficient? Or is there something more?
Yeah, a complete factory wipe would be sufficient.
Probably number, I'd say as well.
Change number possibly, yeah. Yeah, I mean, just completely clear the phone off. Like the complete wipe will be your best bet, just to start fresh as well. Completely clear the whole thing. Definitely change the number because things that might be tied to the number, you want to just tie somewhere else basically. So like there's a lot of logins and tokens and stuff that will be tied to one number. You can now tie to a different number that someone may not have access to as well. That does bring up a good point you mentioned about that we didn't mention here is, yeah, just being able to secure your numbered account and where you might have your provider and stuff like that, and taking extra steps to protect your identity in those situations, because there's something known as SIM swapping or SIM jacking, where someone will try to clone your SIM card and then get like any messages meant for your phone to another phone. Typically, if you audit your cell bill each month, you can see if something like that has happened, or you talk to the carriers about that. You can try to see if something weird has gone on in those cases. But yeah, you want to do those things as well. But you want to start fresh with the new phone and new number.
Yeah, I'd say that extends to all your personal accounts. Yep. So just change all your passwords as well, yep, just for everything. Assume it's all compromised and yeah, start fresh.
Yeah, yeah, even desktops and laptops, just everything.
Just adding to his comment. So removing the memory, would it be something that will prevent somebody from getting to me?
So you can't remove the memory anymore, unfortunately, on a lot of these phones, or even the batteries. So they're everything's just kind of hard connected into the system itself. So typically once you have the phone again, you can go and wipe everything off the device itself.
Or just use cheap devices, and I suppose that has a different set of risks though, because they often aren't updated frequently, but I guess it's just another option to keep in mind. Just keep a cheap device, and then when you're ready to move, throw it out, get a proper one.
Yeah, yeah. So if you use like a burner phone type of situation like that, you could use it for a bit, then just get a new one. Yeah, for sure. Cool. All right, thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks, guys.